Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Sam Jacobs from 6 Degrees Investor Relations. I'll be hosting today's presentation from EIQ Chief Commercial Officer, Dion Stridham. The webinar today will provide a detailed update on the commercialization timeline for Echosolve, which is EIQ's proprietary AI-backed decision support platform, which assists in the detection of structural heart disease. Today's presentation follows the company's recent submission to the FDA for market clearance of Echosolve AS, which is the company's decision support tool to assist specifically in the detection of aortic stenosis. That submission followed positive engagement with US regulators at the pre-submission stage, and a formal decision by the FDA is now anticipated in early August. The presentation will also include further details on the formal commencement of a clinical study carried out in partnership with leading research group St Vincent's Institute of Medical Research, using the Echosolve platform to improve detection rates for the risk of heart failure. After the presentation, we'll commence a Q&A session, which will include written submissions from the audience. So please feel free to send in your questions via the questions pane in the GoToWebinar panel, or you can also email them to me as the moderator. My address is sam.jacobs@sdir.com.au. Just lastly, a copy of the webinar, a copy of the presentation will be available on EIQ's website and social media platforms later today, and the webinar as well. And you can also download a copy of the presentation by navigating to the handouts pane in the control panel or via the ASX platform. So for now, I'll hand over to Dion to kick things off. Dion, the floor is yours.
Sam, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Sam mentioned, I'm Dion Stridham, Chief Commercial Officer at EIQ. With me today, I have Mr. Andrew Grover, Executive Chair, and Professor Jeff Strange, Chief Research and Strategy Officer. This is our first attempt at an investor webinar, and the reason we decided on this approach today is, as most of you will know, we've pretty much been working in stealth and behind the curtains for the last 12 to 18 months. And now is a really exciting time as we head into commercialization. So the purpose of today's webinar is not a deal roadshow. It's really to give you some insights into what we expect in the next 12 to 18 months as we start with the commercialization. So the standard disclaimers apply to this presentation. And a quick corporate snapshot. At the end of last quarter, we had 1.7 million in the bank. We've got 2.2 million options expected to be exercised by the end of June this year. I would say as well that a majority of those shares have already been received and are within our bank account. And then there's additional $1.2 million in R&D rebate, which we will expect to get by the end of this year. We're very fortunate that we have a very experienced board as well, but more than that is our board members are also some of our largest investors within the business, and that is all through private investment. So the rest of the presentation, what we'll do, we'll hand over to Professor Strange to talk you through about what the real problem is that we're trying to solve, and then how EIQ goes about resolving that problem. And that will be followed by some commercial slides. So I'll hand over to Professor Strange.
Thanks, Dion. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Professor Jeff Strange. I'm the professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Sydney. I'm the professor in the School of Medicine at the University of Notre Dame, the senior academic lead at the Heart Research Institute, and I'm the founder and creator of the database that supplies the engine, if you like, for the AI to work its magic. So we are here today to talk about the problem that we're trying to solve. And really this relates to the complexity of diagnosis of structural heart disease. It's the leading cause of death worldwide, and unfortunately delayed or misdiagnosis is something that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And of course, treatment delays costs lives, and that's what we're in the business of doing. The challenges in this diagnosis really relate to the pictures on your screen. If you look in the top right-hand corner, you can see a three-dimensional structure of the heart. You can see the arteries that wrap around the heart. And within that heart, you've got 4 chambers, both ventricles and atria, with valves in between each of those, and you've got different pressure gradients, different vortexes, different stages of contraction and relaxation. And in the middle of your screen, you've got a 2-dimensional pixel-generated ultrasound response image. And you have to be able to look at that pixel-generated 2-dimensional response of blood flow in the complexity of hemodynamics using the most important tool we use every day, which is transthoracic echocardiogram, to determine what disease the patient that's in front of you on the table has. This is a very, very difficult process with multiple numbers, multiple dimensions, and the time allocated mostly to be able to report these studies is approximately 10 minutes. So what we're doing is we're harnessing the power of our big data, and we're applying the power of artificial intelligence to enhance decision support for our colleagues trying to give both an early detection and an improved accuracy in diagnosis of all forms of structural heart disease. So what we're doing is trying to create a two-pronged approach in early detection and improved diagnosis. And in doing that, we're focusing on this structural heart disease. We've got aortic stenosis, which I'll talk about shortly, which is a stiffening of the main valve that leaves the ventricle that supplies blood to the rest of the body. We've got some preliminary work with mitral regurgitation, and I'll talk to you about our new expedition into one of the most important diseases in structural heart disease, being heart failure. So aortic stenosis, if you have a look at the timeline across here, we've developed the algorithm. The algorithm was developed on more than 450,000 patients, tested on nearly 200,000 patients. We then validated that in late 2022, 2023 at both St Vincent's Hospital here in Sydney and Melbourne, as well as the Harvard group of schools at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Centre. And that allowed us to further advance our work on our US regulatory study. And of course, that's now been submitted. And we are in the pointy end of activity specifically related to commercialization. That FDA submission, as pointed out up front, was only a few weeks ago, and we expect feedback from the FDA within the next couple of months. So this is what we have applied for FDA clearance on. This is the product. The product itself, of course, is software as a service, but the interactions, the user interface on the right-hand side, you can see the handheld user interface, which obviously gives you the ability to triage patients on the go. This gives you a real-time alert system that you can send through to whomever the institution thinks is the most appropriate person to receive those alerts. And all of this takes about 3 seconds. So this is a rapid response of results for the reporting clinician in real time to get this 360-degree view of what's happening in the heart, not just what's happening in the valve, but how the ventricle responds to that, how the atria responds to that, and how the pulmonary circulation responds. So in that really short period of time, we give what we call the phenotype, or all of the set of variables that come together to form the set of criteria that you would diagnose a patient on. So you could say a 360-degree view of the heart, and that's backed up by some guideline guardrails. So as an example of what the artificial intelligence is doing, and part of our FDA clearance application is running over retrospective data, in this case, nearly 10,000 patients from St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney. And in the red, you can see that what the human detection alone rate was. So this is 218 patients. And then in the subsequent blue columns, you can see that Echosolve almost doubles the number, improves the detection rate by 72% compared to the human alone. And in fact, when you take into account all of those patients that are at high risk of death, it's more than doubling the numbers. What was really alarming in this study was that women were 66% less likely to receive an accurate diagnosis compared to their male counterparts. And of course, inequity of care delivery is something that's really a problem globally, and it's something that not only are we addressing the inequities of gender, we're also addressing the inequities of age, symptomatology, and hemodynamic profiles. Of course, our primary focus for Echosolve is the US market, and we've been working with colleagues in the US at major institutions. This particular presentation that's going to be held at New York Valves next week, the 5th of June, over in New York, demonstrates for the first time really a featured independent analysis of our proprietary software working on one of America's largest network of hospitals. More than 250,000 patients were in this review, and they'll be presenting this at the biggest valve meeting independent of us over in New York next week. So if I can turn your attention now to heart failure, this is the subsequent product that we're in the throes of developing now. We've tested the algorithm, trained it and tested it in-house, and we're now working toward further validation of that. Heart failure itself is the inability of the heart to pump enough nutrients, both oxygen and supply, to the body to meet its metabolic need. And this takes two forms. One is that the pump of the heart fails. The other is that the muscle of the heart becomes thick. Just like bodybuilders who work too hard, they end up being really quite large and can't move too much. The same thing happens to the heart when it works too hard for too long. The walls become thick, they become fibrotic, and they're not able to open up to allow blood to come in. So you end up with these two forms of heart failure: systolic, being pump function, or diastolic, relaxation problems. And both of those forms of heart failure are in fact the largest cause of hospitalization in patients above 65 worldwide, and indeed the #1 cause of rehospitalization. So anything we can do to decrease the impact of heart failure worldwide is really significant. Remembering this affects more than 64 million people worldwide. There's $70 billion worth of investment in heart failure management across the board. And unfortunately, about a quarter of patients end up rehospitalized, which causes a huge burden on the healthcare system and a huge cost to institutions. And so early detection and improved strategic, accurate diagnosis, those two pivot points that we're looking at, is critical in the heart failure segment. So currently, the biggest problem we've got is that only 40% of patients, so 20% you can say definitely have it, and 20% you can say definitely don't have it, which leaves the vast majority in the middle where we're unable to, according to clear current guidelines, give an accurate diagnostic determination on those particular patients. And in fact, the guidelines call that indeterminate outcome from the echocardiographic test. What we're doing is we are applying our algorithm trained on this large data set across Australia to be able to give a diagnosis or a decision support or an output on all patients that the algorithm goes over, which really could double the number of patients that are detected early with more accuracy in heart failure, contributing substantially to a reduction in those healthcare costs. We've got a very clear and precise pathway which we're turbocharging for heart failure. This is something that we're really super focused on right now. We've already tested and validated the data in-house on our data. We've just received all of the data from St Vincent's Hospital and and Monash University, where we're taking all of that data in. We're currently crunching those numbers. That should put us in a very good position very shortly to be able to talk with our pre-submission process with the FDA. The FDA have changed their rules slightly in the last 12 to 18 months, which allows us to really fast track a US clinical validation. We don't need to recruit patients prospectively, we just need to run the algorithm over patients retrospectively, which will allow us to fast track our FDA application. And with that, I'll be happy to take questions later on, but I'll hand back over to Dion to talk about the commercialization strategy.
Thanks, Jeff. So the question then becomes, how do we commercialize the software? So our real focus is on reimbursement. So the way that the reimbursement works is there's a revenue share model in place where we do a revenue share model with the institutions. So for aortic stenosis, the anticipated reimbursement is $68. We expect about a 25% revenue share. So if you consider that there are 5 million echoes done per annum for aortic stenosis, on a 2% penetration, that's $1.7 million in ARR. The key thing, however, to remember on that number is that our margins are in the high 90s with this. It's a software that gets deployed in the cloud and can all be done remotely. So the margins are really high. If you then go across to heart failure, you'll see that that reimbursement is substantially higher than aortic stenosis. And the reason for that is what Professor Strange mentioned earlier. This is the #1 reason for hospitalizations in the US. And more importantly, 25% of patients have a 30-day readmission rates. So the hospital get penalized severely for any patients that get returned within 30 days, up to 3% of their total revenue. So for them to try and find these patients early on is really, really important. But I also want to put these numbers into context. As you saw, 2% penetration for heart failure will be 120,000 patients. For the study that's being presented at New York Valve, we analyzed more than 230,000 echoes for just one single hospital group. So what I'm trying to get across is that the potential is really big in this space. Our next approach is through licensing. Now, the three clear groups that we focus on for licensing are device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and then hardware producers. So for the purpose of this presentation, we'll focus on the pharmaceutical companies. So typically what a licensing agreement will look like will be an upfront fee on signing. There'll be some milestone payments based on the different milestones, including something like reimbursement. And then there'll be a royalty. And the royalty is typically based on the uplift on market share for that product or for that portfolio. So myself and Professor Strange are off to the US exactly next week, this time Friday. And part of that 2-week trip, we'll be meeting with a number of device manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and hardware producers over their time to continue the discussion we've already commenced. So these are advanced discussions. And now that we're so close to FDA clearance, the urgency has certainly ramped up in terms of the discussion perspective. So if you are currently an investor in our company, we'd like to thank you for your support. If you don't have Echo IQ in your portfolio, here are some reasons for you to consider Echo IQ as a good stock. We have exclusive access to NETA, which helps us to continue building out new products and new technologies. Our FDA application is literally a few days away, so we should have an answer within the next few days. As Professor Strange mentioned, we've got a really strong product portfolio, and heart failure is a real game changer in terms of the market size once that's finalized. And there's a significant market opportunity to impact the world's biggest health challenges. So not only do we believe there's a good return, but if you are an ethical investor, we know for a fact that this technology will save people's lives. And then lastly, and most importantly, we also have a very strong advisory board, which I'll share with you in a second. We also have an engaged management team who have financial incentives to make this succeed. So from the scientific advisory board, these literally are the who's who of cardiology and AI across the US and the UK. Amongst them, they've got more than 1,200 peer-reviewed papers. So, and these people have all joined the organization based on what they know the differences will make to medicine in the long run. So with that, we'll now open it to any questions that you may have.
Yeah, thank you, Dion and Dr. Strange. So during the presentation, we had some questions, and there are also some questions from other investors submitted beforehand. But Dion, perhaps kicking off or extending the conversation around commercialization, one question from an investor was sort of a two-part question, but they asked, who are your competitors in the marketplace for using AI as a diagnostic support tool for aortic stenosis in particular and other heart conditions? They noted that Anumana through the Mayo Clinic appear to be offering a similar product. So how is Echosolve similar or different relative to its competitors?
Yeah, no, good question. So the competitors basically at this stage, Anumana would be one of them. iCardio would be another one, but the differences are quite substantial. So let's start with the likes of iCardio. So what iCardio does is they do image recognition, and they really focus in emergency care where you screen something in or out. It's not a very precise diagnosis like ours is. And Anumana, on the other hand, is purely based on ECG. So that is what physicians will use, or primary care physicians, to go, yes, we believe you've got the condition or not, but it will never be a primary diagnostic tool to screen in for aortic stenosis or not. So if anything, an Omada usage will increase echoes. So they'll always go for an echo post a ECG to qualify if someone does have aortic stenosis or not. And I'm sure I'm biased, but as far as I know, Echo IQ is the gold standard in disease diagnosis and risk diagnosis for aortic stenosis. Jeff, have I missed anything from a...
No, I think that the primary difference there is that ECG or electrocardiogram simply measures electrical impulses across the heart and demonstrates that graphically, whereas the ultrasound is always going to be the #1 diagnostic tool to be able to determine whether someone has aortic stenosis. So one may be suggestive in a cursory perspective, but it will never be definitive, and ours will be definitive and enabling decision support, and that's why they're completely separate and really chalk and cheese, to be honest.
Thank you. Yeah, so next question, continuing on the sort of commercialization and regulatory pathway, turning to the FDA for a minute. Based on discussions to date, one investor asked, are commercial customers wanting FDA approval before signing up to use Echosolve? And if so, is FDA approval kind of the final roadblock, in your opinion, to commercialization, or is obtaining insurance reimbursements also important?
So I'll answer the first part first. Do hospitals wait for FDA clearance before using the product? Categorically, yes. So what they have been doing is using it under what's referred to as investigational use, but they can't use this commercially until it's been cleared. So they're risk averse, as hospitals should be. So once we get our clearance in place, that's the last hurdle before we can start commercializing. Would it be good to have reimbursement? Absolutely, yes, it would. But we also have a strategy in place prior to achieving reimbursement, where these hospitals can sign up prior to reimbursement, and then once we do get reimbursement, the contract flips over to the reimbursed model. But yeah, the final hurdle that we need right now is to get FDA clearance before they can start using this commercially.
Right. And so just building on the engagement with hospitals and cardiologists to date as part of the development process, as well as that FDA approval, what one investor asked, sort of what has the feedback been like more broadly across the board, just as part of the product development stage, and sort of how you're liaising with hospitals and partners through that process to date?
Okay. So the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, right? And so to date, we've had more than 400,000 users across America in, once again, in investigational use. But that's us saying it. So on the 5th of June, we'll have the first time where some independent group will be saying how they found the product and what they thought the utility and the value is independently from Echo IQ. And I think, though we don't know exactly what they'll be saying, this will be a huge endorsement for us as a business once we get independent group present their findings on what they thought the technology did for their hospitals. But I know a number of them have also been speaking to Professor Strange and his colleague, Professor David Playford. So I may ask Jeff, what's been your feedback from clinically from the physicians?
Yeah, thanks, Dion. So I think that the feedback that we've received is really overwhelmingly positive, and it's positive in a couple of ways. One is, as I said up front, this is actually quite a complex diagnosis. And one of the things that happens when you have a stiff valve is that the ventricle eventually fails. So it's not like you sitting down pumping up a bicycle tube and you've got the pump in your hand and you're pushing against that resistance. Eventually your bicep fails. And this is what happens in the heart. Eventually the heart fails pushing against this stiff valve. And when the heart starts to fail, it really muddies the water, because now the heart can't generate the same pressure through the valve that we use to trigger the diagnosis. So it becomes really complex. And this phenotype, this multi-dimensional pieces of the puzzle that come together with the artificial intelligence, really gives the reporting clinician insights into the patient that they wouldn't have previously. And so that's the feedback we're getting in those complex cases, that this is going to be a godsend to allow them to differentiate between the patients that need to be referred to the heart care team for a new valve and those that don't, and those that they need to watch more closely. So a really great feedback for us as the developers, and particularly myself, creating this algorithm to try and enhance patients' outcomes and improve lives. That's the feedback that's really hit me hard.
Nice one. Thanks, guys. So perhaps a little bit more specifically on commercialization, one investor referred to your US partner, Castling, a US health development network the company signed an agreement with last year. Just generally, they asked how are things progressing with Castling, Echo IQ's US distribution partner, and is there any specific feedback to provide from their representative or customer groups?
Yeah, sure. So Castling started off with 3 representatives doing a market seeding strategy for us. Now that we're close to commercialization, they've increased that footprint to 45 sales representatives across the US. They've all been trained. Myself and Professor Strange will be over in the US, as I said, next week this time. And as part of that trip, we'll be meeting with 10 of the customers that are nearest in the commercial pipeline to try and help progress it along the way. The pipeline that we have at the moment from Castling is 93 customers. So the goal would be to go and support them in terms of clinical validation and further implementation. So Castling has certainly increased the footprint now that they know we're close to getting our FDA clearance.
Thanks, Dion. And yeah, just on that upcoming visit, a couple of investors were interested in that point, and just along with those specific groups, can you sort of conclude or just finalize, how long that trip, how long you'll be over there for, and really what you want to achieve from that visit more broadly?
Sure. So we'll be over from the 1st until the 17th, and the purpose is multiple purpose, right? So we're going to the 2 conferences, the one being New York Valve, and the other one being ACE, which is the Echocardiogram conference in Portland. And the purpose is to meet with, as we said, these pipeline customers that Castling have set up for us. But more importantly, we're also meeting with 3 of the largest pharmaceutical companies that have drugs within the heart failure space for ongoing discussions. We're meeting with a number of valve manufacturers as part of this discussion. And then finally, we're also meeting with 1 or 2 of the hardware manufacturers. So all of these have certainly increased their interest since they know we're pretty close to commercialization. And then on the back of that as well, myself and Professor Strange will be doing more frequent trips to the US, perhaps at least 1 or 2 weeks every quarter.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. So next question in, Ren Bly, investment advisor at Audmanet, just had a query on back to that FDA approval process. Obviously, hopefully it's a simple yes in terms of that regulatory pathway. But if not, has the FDA provided feedback on a sort of step-by-step process if there's some sort of layers involved to final regulatory approval?
I'll take that one. So the process, obviously, we've gone through. We've had external regulatory support on this and external feedback and review. We've submitted that as we said in May. We should expect feedback from the FDA within 90 days. They give us a 30-day feedback, which basically says all of the boxes are ticked. That's on the 1st of June, I believe. And from that point on, obviously they'll do their review process and give us our feedback in early August. There is as always is, there's a remote possibility that they may come back with some questions, and that's normally a 30-day turnaround, whether that's just clarifying points, numbers here, whatever. That's a fairly standard process. We would hope that we get straight through, but I think that there's a normal process of review that happens, but expect that within 30 days.
Yeah, thanks. It's really useful context. Dion, perhaps back to you. Just another query's come in from the floor on the upcoming US trip. there was just a question here. Will the company also be meeting with any financial institutions, fund managers or brokers over in the US?
So the answer to that is yes. The intention is certainly to meet with a number of funds while in the US. We do believe that getting US investment into the stock would be healthy for us. We are very much a US focused business, so it makes sense for us to meet with some US investors while we're over there.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks. So I think we've delved in some detail on that commercialization and regulatory pathway for Echosolve and Echosolve AS in particular. Perhaps looking more broadly at the Echo IQ product development pipeline now, there was one question in respect to the recent research into the application of Echosolve for heart failure. Just a general query, what sort of led the company to pursue heart failure as its next need state when looking across the various applications that the technology could have been used for?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it really comes back to the fact that it's one of the single biggest problems in structural heart disease worldwide. As I said, there's 64 million people worldwide with this disease. It's a growing epidemiological picture. We've got an aging population. We've got a growing, both from an obesity perspective, but as well as a population perspective, a growing population and an aging population. So this is really a targeted solution for one of the world's most complex cardiovascular problems. And remember, nearly every single person that has some form of coronary artery disease ends up with heart failure as well, once they've had some damage to their heart muscle. So this is a strategic focus on one of the biggest problems we've got in cardiovascular medicine, and what a great picture for an Australian company to be solving one of the world's biggest problems with our sophisticated level of artificial intelligence.
Nice one. And perhaps staying with that outlook for the application of Echosolve for heart failure, one investor just asked if the company has been in discussions with any US groups with whom it could undertake a US-based clinical study alongside the ongoing studies for Echosolve AS.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we, as I alluded to, we intend to turbocharge our process for heart failure, both as a commercial advantage, but as well as ensuring that we expedite any clinical data required, as well as our reimbursement strategy. So we're fully behind that process, with all of the company moving in that same direction. So of course we're having discussions with big institutions in the US to make sure that we can find the appropriate population to validate our algorithms on. Obviously, you know, without going into detail on who, we need to cover that particular group of patients, and we're having those discussions as we speak.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. This is probably another one for Jeff, but just in the context of the technology, a question's come in from the floor, sort of a broad query, but in terms of the Echo IQ software, with all the different potential applications, is the software compatible with all existing Echo facilities without the need for additional hardware upgrades as well, I guess, without the need for sort of additional CapEx?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, it's one thing that my colleague and I, Professor David Plavin, talked about a lot when we worked with the engineers here at Echo IQ, and that is to ensure that what we produce fits within the current workflow. And that's a really important point, to make sure that we're disruptive enough to allow an advancement in the ability to diagnose these patients. And we've got a technology that's a significant step up, but not too disruptive so that you've got to go and reconfigure your entire lab. You want to stay within the workflow so that really it's a seamless integration to ensure that the process actually is both expedited from a time perspective, but improved from a diagnostic accuracy perspective, which ultimately improves the position of the hospital, improves the position that the cardiologists are in, and ultimately a better outcome for patients. Really good question. Thanks for asking.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, having looked at commercialization and R&D, both for Echosolve AS and the broader development pipeline. That just about rounds out the post-presentation questions, but perhaps one to close out with, just looking at the technology more broadly. Is the company, and this could be for Dion or Jeff, but is the company currently looking at other conditions as well where the technology might be a suitable application? There's been talk of mitral regurgitation in the past, but have others been earmarked following the latest heart failure trials?
Yeah, so I might just take this briefly and then let you expand on that from an acquisition perspective. With regards to future R&D, of course, the heart is a complex hemodynamic figure of 8 loop, if you like. You have blood flow through the heart into the lungs, from the lungs back to the heart, from the heart to the body back to the heart. And so this infinity sign of blood flow impacts in lots of different areas. So you have the mitral valve as you described. You've got the tricuspid valve, which we can look at, and its impact in covering pulmonary hypertension. Heart failure itself causes pulmonary hypertension, and we're looking at that. So there's all of that component of structural heart disease. The next cab off the rank, if you like, would be mitral regurgitation, tricuspid regurgitation, to both valve-related problems, pulmonary hypertension, and then we move forward from there.
We went almost without the whole presentation without disagreeing slightly. But yeah, here's mine. So what Professor Strange is saying is exactly right. But our sole focus right now is 2 things, right? We focused on aortic stenosis and heart failure. These are 2 large conditions, and our focus is to commercialize this in the US. I know the FDA can come back. I'm still optimistic that we'll have a reply within the 90-day period. So within the next few days, we should have a reply. And our focus is solely focused on commercializing in the US for those 2 conditions. Everything else, I suppose, from our side would be a very nice to have, but this company would be successful if we can successfully commercialize on those 2 alone. So I completely agree with what Professor Strange is saying, but I see that all as upside. Right now, we want to be a disciplined approach to getting the FDA clearance as quickly as possible, and we still expect it in early August.
Yeah, thanks, Dion. I think that's a nice way to conclude the presentation. So, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, that just about concludes today's webinar. Obviously, thank you to Dion and Dr. Strange for the presentation and taking the time to answer those investor questions there. Thanks also to our attendees and those who submitted the questions for the Q&A. As mentioned earlier, a recording of the webinar will be on EchoIQ's website and social media platforms later on today. So yeah, Dion or Dr. Strange, just before we go, are there any final comments that you wanted to add?
Nope.
On my side, it's exciting times ahead. We're now in the exciting stage. I respect everything my colleague does, but that's all the scientific stuff, and now's the time to get commercialization on track. So exciting times ahead, and thank you for everyone's support to date. We'll make sure we do you proud. Thanks.
Thanks again, gentlemen. Well, yeah, that wraps things up for today. So thanks again to the presenters and attendees. And again, a copy of that webinar will be available on the relevant platforms later on this afternoon. Thank you.